Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today I'd like to talk about the subject of why one should watch old movies. Now, something I'd like to add is that this also applies to old music, because for technological reasons, old popular music, popular music of the sort we have now and movies of the sort we have now, which is basically all of them, both originate at more or less the same point in history. They're not exactly, but they're actually pretty close. And while we do have audio recordings going before the advent of talkies, that is to say, movies with sound, um, the recording quality is so low one wouldn't listen to it very much. But the technologically they're sort of coincident, and the same thing also applies to reading books. And actually, I would like to start with the books because C.S. Lewis gives a really good argument for why it is one should read older books. And much of this applies to movies, and it's sort of clear in books. I want to start there and work in. It doesn't take long, because the basic thing that C.S. Lewis pointed out is that every time period and culture in that time period has its prejudices. It has its things that it gets right easily. It has its things that it takes a tremendous amount of effort to get right. It has the things it sees easily. It has its blind spots. It has the virtues that come easily. It has the vices that come easily. It has the virtues that are hard and the vices it's just not prone to. And so when you put all this together, all of these things will be embedded into a book that you read, whether fiction or nonfiction. And if you go back more than a few hundred years, mostly you're just talking about nonfiction. They're epic poems and stuff, but like novels as we know them are only about 300-400 years old, whereas you can find works of, things like philosophy and other subjects going back, 2,500 years roughly. So, as you read this stuff, the various assumptions that are just embedded in it that in your own time period will just confirm your own prejudices will not be present. There'll be other prejudices, other things that would confirm people in their time, but which aren't so natural to us. And this serves two extremely useful functions, one of which is that it helps you to be aware of what your own prejudices are. And I mean that in the neutral sense of things prejudging, not prejudice in the negative sense, but rather like this, to be in favor of this and against that sort of by instinct. I mean prejudice in that sense, not like I hate people for no reason prejudice, but rather prejudices like, a modern American prejudice tends to be very much in favor of individual autonomy and to very much downplay things like group responsibility. That's the prejudice of a modern American to a great degree. Individuals will vary, of course, but by and large, yes. Whereas if you look at, it's very easy to find in say, older Chinese literature, or heck, modern Chinese stuff for that matter, like just look at Jet Li's Hero, very much a prejudice in favor of your group responsibility is what really matter, and the individual is nowhere near as significant. Going across cultures, going across times, you just get different things like that. That's what I mean by prejudices. They help you to be aware of your own. They also, help you to be aware of possible others so that you're in a better position to think about these things and come to more of a reasoned out judgment as to who is right and about what. Not that the modern time is going to be all wrong, or that the ancient time is going to be all wrong, or that either will be all right, but to really think about things and be much more aware of them. The other thing is it will be very healthy for you to be challenged on things that modern culture just makes very comfortable for you. And it will be also very helpful to basically see people who have a horror at vices that you don't really, sort of wink twice at. So you'll find places, you'll find cultures and times where people were horrified by dishonesty, where their reaction to the idea that you would lie to someone was very, very strong. And that's very salutary in a culture where the idea of where telling the truth is not that big a deal in many regards. And so it goes. It's very useful for all of these reasons. It's very healthy for you. Um, in terms of the things that you don't assume. And the other thing about it, though, which C.S. Lewis didn't really talk about nearly as much, he talked much more about, challenging the things that you take for granted so that you do more active thinking about everything. Um, But the other thing is the vices that are just sort of taken for granted in another time period that would comfort people in that time period aren't going to have that negative effect on you because you're not conditioned to just sort of assume those. So like the idea of mistreating slaves in plenty of cultures and plenty of times was just sort of a natural kind of thing. The idea that your slave should just be useful to you and you shouldn't really care all that much about him. You'll find that in plenty of times, throughout ancient literature, um, and depending on where you're talking about in more modern stuff too. But especially for say like a modern American, that really rankles. That doesn't seem right at all. And so it's not going to just sort of slip in and you won't notice it and you'll be incorrect about the world with, sort of just drifting along because you don't have the right sort of upbringing and cultural background and so on for that to just slip by unnoticed. And so there's actually sort of a double benefit. Not only does it correct the mistakes that you're prone to making because of the particular time period you live in, the ancient stuff is also much less likely to just slip in their own mistakes because you weren't raised in such a way to just sort of pick them up without noticing. And that is what I'd like to segue into modern music and modern movies, because these things are all very much periods of their time. And as works of art, they embed ideas about how life works. And I know there's the idea you'll find about like, art should just entertain, it shouldn't be ideology. But that's kind of nonsensical. I mean, in order to make a work of art, you have to have relationships between multiple things. That's sort of what makes it a work of art, really. And so you have, a character do something and then consequences happen. And then there are reactions to those consequences. So, for example, just really simply, like a man decides not to fulfill his responsibilities to people who are depending upon him, but instead to go off on the walking tour of New Zealand that he's always wanted to go on. And he leaves these people high and dry. Now, does this man, when he's on this walking tour, is he happy or is he miserable? And later on working through life, like as this progresses, what are the consequences of this? And are they happy? Has he made the right choice in the sense of, for himself, he is now inspired and fulfilled? And yes, it's unfortunate these other people got screwed over by what he did, but he's now really happy? Or is he constantly being eaten away at? You can see that sort of thing very, very, very clearly in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, where the protagonist kills somebody, and then, much to his surprise, he's utterly eaten up with not precisely remorse, but his conscience gets at him, and he is also terrified because he has, in doing so, put himself outside of society. And these are things he did not expect at all. And so he is, instead of just enjoying the money that he got by way of the murder that he did, which he, sort of rationally calculated, all made perfect sense. The old woman was, she was bad and she didn't really use her money anyway, and he would enjoy it more. And this all made perfect sense. And then it didn't work out that way. And so whatever happens afterwards, like if you spend your 20s and 30s just partying away and not laying any sort of groundwork for the future, and then suddenly realize that, in your 40s, I would actually kind of like a family. How does that work out? Does that work out just fine? Or does that work out terribly? Is this a happy story? Does it have a happy ending? Or is this more like a Russian tragedy where everything goes wrong in the end? All of those things tell you things about life, some of them correct, some of them incorrect. So art is intrinsically going to teach you things about reality because it relates things, and it, unless you're talking about sort of a comedy where the whole point is it relates things in ways that don't actually relate, then, well, somewhat. That's one aspect of comedy, not the totality thereof. But anyway, unless you're talking about things like farce and comedy, the thing is, it's going to have ideas which come across. Some of them will be ridiculous. Some of them will be sort of oh yeah, it makes sense because, it's true. Or, oh yeah, it makes sense because this is just the way within your culture you're conditioned to think. But like with books and how the prejudices of a different era just, don't slide past when you're not from that time period because you're not culturally conditioned for it, the same is true of movies and songs and television too. When you watch these things from a different era, they had different concerns, different things they're trying to think through. They had different underlying assumptions, prejudices, and so on. different attitudes, and they are no longer the attitudes and stuff that we have. And so they don't just sort of slip by. They don't, the mistakes that are embedded into it, because these are the sort of mistakes that everybody was making, which may at the time have confirmed somebody who's, sort of his time period in those mistakes, are no longer going to do that because those are not the particular mistakes. And what's interesting about art is they have to be fairly particular to really slip by unnoticed. Art has to be very much of its time, or you much have to be very much of the time of the art to really not notice the stuff that is unconsciously, the incorrect stuff that's sort of just unconsciously taken for granted within the art. And this is why older stuff is much, much safer than modern stuff. Older stuff is, and there's an asterisk I'm gonna have to throw on to the age of the viewer here, but older stuff, because you're not of its time period, is not nearly as dangerous. It's not going to, um, it's not going to sort of twist your ideas. Now, this is especially important, by the way, when it comes to what children watch. Being a parent, this is especially on my mind. Um, that if a child grows up watching only stuff that is made right at the time when it's growing up, everything it's watching is going to have the same mistakes built into it. It's going to have the same underlying assumptions. It's going to be much better at just slipping the same mistakes embedded into the art, whether intentionally or unintentionally. The people making the art may well just think these mistakes are truth and not be putting them in as propaganda, but just trying to be realistic to real life. It's really irrelevant whether it's propaganda or slid in. The only thing that matters is that it is false and that it is ubiquitous, and as such tends to be believed as true by the people receiving it. A good example, I'm going to make a full video on this. All right. Actually, I'll just talk about the one I did make. I talked about authority figures in movies and the idea of these, stern, "you will obey my authority," type authority figures, where you see these all over the place. But that's mostly just a Hollywood creation. It's not how it really works. But there are a lot of people who sort of imprinted on this idea when it was especially big, that this is what authority looks like, and sort of have this idea that they go forward with. Another one, and this is one I'm going to make a video on later, Revenge of the Nerds sort of thing, where the jocks hated the nerds and crushed them down. And will you find instances of people picking on nerds? Yes, you definitely will. But is this a universal phenomenon? Is this, did the jocks obsess over trying to destroy the nerds and keep them down? No. No, that's not a universal phenomenon. You'll find it in places. You will find a jock who hated a nerd. You'll certainly find that sort of thing. Definitely happened. That said, it is by no means a universal phenomenon. It is not the essence of being a jock to hate nerds. It's the essence of being a jock to like sports. That's it. That's what being a jock really is about. And for the most part, jocks aren't threatened by nerds, and so they're not going to react in sort of defensive ways you see in things like Revenge of the Nerds and so on. And that, what you actually see in these movies is largely projected insecurity. But this is something I've pointed out to people. Like, look at it. Like, and here's a really, really good example. Be a nerd who wants to actually take up weightlifting. Go into the gym. Be scrawny, not very strong. The people who are generally going to be nicest to you in the gym are the big guys. The really large, muscular people. Like, you have to know not to interrupt them in the middle of what they're doing. It takes a little bit of skill in a gym to recognize when is somebody just killing a little bit of time in between sets, so it doesn't really matter to him, whether or not he goes and spots somebody, or whether or not he gives a person a piece of advice or whatever. As long as you can recognize that, so you're respectful of another person's time, my experience has always been the big guys in the gym are the people who are most willing to help you out, who are most enthusiastic about helping you out, and who will be most encouraging, because they know how much hard work goes into lifting and into getting big and strong, and by and large, they think it's cool when other people see value in the things they see value in. So they tend to like helping. Individuals will vary, of course. But I've met lots of people, fellow nerds, because I sure as heck am one, that have this idea from movies from a certain time period, nerds of a certain age, who have this idea that nerds were frequently picked on. People growing up now will probably have a different sort of idea, because nerds get depicted a little bit differently in more modern stuff. So it'll vary. And this is something that's kind of interesting too. Watching contemporary stuff is not quite as dangerous the older you get, because you're really a creature of a different time period. And so as long as it's not really the movies that are meant for you at a given time period, the older you get, the less dangerous contemporary stuff becomes, simply because by virtue of being from a different time period yourself, having your prejudices more set from when you were, younger, you're just not really of the time period these movies are being made in anymore. So there is that. But when it comes to children and the formation of children through the things that they are exposed to, they are probably the people to whom it is most important to make sure that they see a wide variety of time period, things from a wide variety of time periods, that they don't grow up all on one time period. But rather, if you can have them grow up on a wide variety of time periods, they're not going to have the same sort of mistake uniformly coming in from everything. And that's when it gets really insidious. That's when those sort of errors really creep in and just sort of embed themselves into your brain without you noticing. Is when it's everything. When everybody says that this is the way that life works, then you tend to think like, okay, that's the way that life works. Everyone uniformly says it, so presumably it's true, because most things that everyone says are true. The sun will come up tomorrow. You should wear a coat when it's cold out. The things that everyone will tell you, well, mostly they do tend to be true. And so, by making sure that younger children are exposed to stuff from a wide variety of time periods, it doesn't hurt to be from a variety of cultures too, but just a variety of time periods within the same culture will do a lot of the same work. They're going to not have the same mistakes in everything that they see, and so they're going to be a lot less prone to simply taking mistakes in any given one thing as just the way life is. This is true, however, for everybody. Nobody, we are all mutable. I mean, people can change in their 60s, in their 70s, in their 80s. People come up, people hit new interests. People get, change their mind on things as they get older and so on. Nobody's immune to change. Like, as you get older, you change less than during the formative period of your youth, but you never stop changing. And you're never impervious to anything. So for everybody at every age, it is important to make sure you're exposed to a variety of things. And give one other example though, of just the phenomenon of being exposed to something different and not picking up its same mistakes. Singer that I really like is Phil Oakes. He's a protest singer from the 1960s. He didn't make it. I think he died in the 1970s. And he is one of the more radical of the protest singers. He made a number of really good songs. And one of the things that's kind of interesting, because I started listening to him in the 1990s was when I got exposed to him. And, as a teenager then. And it was interesting that there are universal truths in his songs. Like the song, a good example of this is the song I Ain't Marching Anymore. Or I'm Not Marching Anymore, I forget exactly. And it goes through a list of songs. I fought in the Battle of New Orleans at the end of the early British War, which is the battle that was actually, it's kind of famous for being a battle that was between the Americans and the English, that was actually fought after the peace treaty had been signed. But the peace treaty had been signed, I think, over in England, if memory serves. Or at the very least on the eastern coast, I think in England. And it took a while for news that the peace treaty had been signed to actually get all the way down to New Orleans, given the technology. So there actually was a battle fought after the war was over, which is sort of famous for that. And within the context, the song was used as the idea of the most pointless possible thing to die in, is a battle in a war that's already over. And so it starts with that and goes to other things, and he traces through, and roughly the point of the song is that there's been too much war in the history of the world. It's so it's so tragic how much war there has been, roughly speaking. The conclusion is we're not going to have any more war, which is stupid, because there's going to still be war in the world. I mean, you don't have to be very old to figure out that merely because bad things are bad, they're not going to happen. And everybody knows that they're bad, they're still going to happen. But the thing is, in the 1990s, that protest era was long gone. The idea that, maybe we can end war, nobody was thinking this. It's too stupid. You can't sustain that idea for a particularly long period of time. There are some people in whom it got embedded as an idea because they were in their very formative years, right at kind of the right time period, and they got stuck with that. But But outside of that, like, yeah, it's dumb. You're never going to end war. That's, you'd have to be like 3 to think you can end war. However, it is very true that war is awful, that war wastes so very much. And this song is a really good song about how wasteful war is, and that's entirely true. So, not being from its time period, I'm not caught up in the yes, let's end war, because you're not going to. Like, you have to be, do your best to try to be responsible about war. But, in this world of sin and woe, bad things are going to happen, and people are going to screw up and make the wrong decisions and so on. Um, the actual thing to put your effort into is to try to do this as well as possible, to try to minimize war as possible, to make sure that all wars are just wars, that all wars are involved in are just war, not things like wars of conquest and wars of aggression and so on. So, um, it's a really good example of that kind of phenomenon, of how being from a different time period, you don't make the same sort of mistakes. It's rallying cry of let's spend our effort stopping war, which, in the time period they wasted their effort doing that, and so there's a bunch of stuff they didn't do which they could have. But in the 1990s, I'm not going to waste any time on that, especially because it's like, one of 3 protest songs I might have listened to amongst, a whole bunch of other songs. At the same time, I'd listen to something like Billy Joel's The Piano Man. Um, at the same time, I would also listen to, the Beatles. I would also listen, to Chris de Burgh singing about The Lady in Red. Being from a different time period, it doesn't seize you in the same way. You're not prone to make the same sort of mistakes. And, again, in movies, you'll see very, very different things. Like the 1970s was an incredibly nihilistic time in American movies. But again, like when you're not in that, when you're not sort of grabbed by this nihilism, eh, like it's kind of dark. You don't really want to watch it more than once. But, something like Saturday Night Fever is kind of interesting to see. Even apart from it's mostly interesting for its historical significance, but it's got a few elements to it which are, interesting in themselves and do transcend their time period. Most of it doesn't transcend its time period, and the sort of nihilistic despair that is almost the center point of the movie, it's inescapable. I mean, you don't not notice it, but at the same time, it's not like, it feeds into the nihilistic despair that you yourself are feeling at the time. So again, it's a movie that's not, um, it's a movie that doesn't, just sort of fill you with the fundamental mistake. It's also interesting, there is also the historical benefit you get from this sort of thing, right? Because, having seen how like dark and nihilistic movies were in the 1970s, dark nihilistic movies now are not a unique phenomenon, nor are they just, one linear arc of history. So it helps to give you better perspective there too, and seeing, where's our own culture going. Um, not to be, cheerily optimistic, but also not to be unduly pessimistic, to see some of the cycles in history are, is itself very interesting, as well as to see, differing approaches. Like, for example, Fred Astaire movies. My favorite are the ones with Ginger Rogers. I haven't seen many of the others. That I especially love Ginger Rogers as an actress. She does a really good job in the roles that she's put in. Um, Even if some of the other dancers are somewhat technically better dancers, I believe. But she just had so much charm and charisma. I'm just especially fond of those movies. Now, many of them were filmed like in the late 1930s during the Great Depression, and you know, part of it is I've read books from the time period. Part of it is, my grandparents grew up during the Great Depression. I heard stories about the Great Depression, and it's interesting to see in that time, what did you see? People often didn't have a ton of money, but they often lucked into it for one reason or another. And you have, beautiful clothes and beautiful costumes and rich sort of things, which is very different than, say, for example, I remember when I was watching The Office a number of years ago, the American version, and there was a minor downturn in the economy. There's a recession going on, and so they decided that in order to be realistic, they had to, show the effects of this, and everything got much harder, and the company was going to go under, and everyone was going to lose their jobs. And those are two very different approaches to the two things, And the one was clearly much better. The older one was much, much better. Like during the time of the recession when things are and compared to the Great Depression, just a little harder. Um, that you don't want to watch fictionalized people going through the same sort of worry that you are. You want to see something different. So that's another benefit to contrasting different approaches to the same sort of phenomenon. Um, but at the same time, there are other things, from movies in the 1930s, which there'll be mistakes that they made that we're not going to see nearly as much either. But another very, very useful thing about watching old movies is that time is a wonderful filter. If somebody is telling you about a movie that you should see that was made 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 80 years ago, um, that in 2019, 80 years ago, I think is about as far back as you're going to get, or close to it. Actually, 80 years ago would put you in 1939, and it's kind of maybe just slightly over. Anyway, the thing about this is if anyone's telling you about this, it's because it was especially good for its time. So there are plenty of terrible movies that were made in those time periods. Actually, something I really enjoy is Mystery Science Theater 3000, which does a lot of finding terrible movies from the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, and making fun of them. So there's lots and lots and lots of bad stuff. But here's the thing, nobody watches that old, for the most part, the bad stuff from those time periods anymore. They only, remember, people remember like what was the good stuff, what's worth like, telling somebody about that's worth actually seeing, from various time periods. And the thing is, the, best 100 movies from 1930 to 1950 are going to be way better than most movies that are going to be made today. The one thing that's not true of is like pure spectacle. Like, CGI is vastly better. Special effects are much better. And in general, the technical things like when you're talking about quality of lighting as opposed to use of lighting. So quality of lighting, like the ability to have large amounts of lights that are, that illuminate everything in sort of a uniform way that really brings out the color and so on, and color correction and things along those lines. Those tend to have gotten better, and older movies don't tend to compare in those ways. Film also often has degenerated a bit too. So the colors are often a little bit washed out from later movies after Technicolor and before the modern processes in roughly the 1980s. Um, but that said, if you can stand the slightly lower technical quality that you will find owing largely to not as good technology, the writing, the acting, and so on that you find in the best movies of the time period are going to be vastly better than almost anything you can see today. Basically, like for the statistical reason that one movie will be the best movie of the year in this year, and one movie will be the best movie of the year in the next year. And so the best movies, each year from 1930 to 1960 is 30 great movies, whereas you can only get one best movie this year from this year. The other thing too, and this gets down to it, is that life tends to be limited in how much time you have for stuff, and watching new movies is very much a crapshoot where the odds are stacked against you. Is this actually a good movie? Odds are pretty poor that it's actually going to be a good movie, and you're being a guinea pig when you go to see it. So I mean, obviously people mitigate this a little bit with things like reviews and so on, but how well does that actually work? Well, I mean, look up bad movies and see how many of them got decent reviews, and most of them, at least mediocre movies will get at least somewhat decent reviews. People tend to have a very, very different threshold for, is this movie worth seeing right now in the theaters versus, is this movie from 10 years ago worth your time? People just put a much, much, much higher bar on that previous one versus the stuff from today. Is it worth seeing in the theaters? For various reasons, people tend to just grade on a massive, massive curve when it comes to that. Because there's very often the built-in assumption, like, yeah, well, you're going to the theater for something. This is probably the best of the ones available right now to see, is the sort of answer you tend to get, oddly enough. So again, you're going to see much, much better things. And when I say better, the important sort of key thing here is that their quality is really about how much do they correspond to real life? How much about real life are you actually going to learn through this art? Because I mean, merely being stimulated is not a good use of time. A pure entertainment in the sense of it was, there were lots of loud noises and I like loud noises, so hey, yay. Or there were lots of bright lights and I enjoy seeing bright lights. That's not really a very good use of your time. I mean, everyone needs to relax on occasion, but there are 10,000 ways to get bright lights and loud noises in the modern world. I mean, you don't need movies for that. Um, Video games are an excellent way to get bright lights and loud noises. You can get bright lights and loud noises, especially if you just adjust your monitor a little bit on and crank the volume up on Tetris. Um, not as bright, not as loud, but I mean, it's really, really easy to find any sort of shoot 'em up game where you get like, quick things and so on. And in the modern era with Twitch and YouTube, you don't even have to play these things yourself. So, and the advantage of watching somebody play a video game is that you're seeing just sort of, as a form of relaxation over watching bad movies or listening to bad music, is that you are getting sort of a much more pure, simple stimulus. This is where sports, by the way, is vastly superior to bad movies, because bad movies lie to you about reality and about how to be happy, whereas sports is just kind of not very consequential and a little bit fluffy. So, does it matter what happens in the basketball game? No. I really like the Mitchell and Webb sketch where, or Mitchell, no, I think it was Webb, it is, no, it actually is Mitchell. Anyway, he was doing the broadcaster announcement for the soccer game, which he called football, because he doesn't live in America, and so he's talking about, it'll be on our channel. There's all football all the time. There'll be this game which will, the championship game coming up. Who will settle who is the best for this year at least, and indeed at most. There are hundreds of hours of football. There are hundreds of games of football coming up, each one mattering colossally to someone, presumably. Yeah. I mean, does it matter? No, because next year it'll be done all over again. Nothing is ever finally decided. Is there anything, how much of how to live a good life, how to be, truly happy is found in watching football, either American or non-American football? Not a ton. Doesn't teach you much about life. Teach a little bit about, some of the physical virtues, but not a whole heck of a lot. On the other hand, it also doesn't lie to you very much. I don't watch sports, by the way. Sports is really generally not my thing. I enjoy playing sports. I just generally don't like watching sports. I mean, other than small little clips of sort of, the highlights of a thing. It's not my thing. But the thing to be said for it is, well, it doesn't do much for you. As a form of relaxation, it doesn't lie to you. And things like books and movies and songs, they can tell you some great truths, but they can also tell you some big lies. And this is why, frankly, when you get down to it, over watching modern movies that might be lying to you and watching sports, which is just kind of, fluff, wait 10 years and find out whether or not the movie was actually any good. And besides, 10 years from now, you'll probably be in a better position to see it anyway. And unless you're pretty old, you've got lots of catching up to do from previous decades of the best movies from then anyway, and the best books, and listening to the best music and so on from those time periods. So yeah, it's sort of one of those things that, like, if your goal is light entertainment, it should be lighter than modern movies and modern songs and so on. It's just a bad gamble at present. Well, doubly so at present. Quadruply so at present, with the degeneration of our culture and the rise of secularism. Modern people generally can't tell a good story anyway. Just look at modern action stories where the basic plot of the modern action story is whether or not the hero is going to be completely worthless like he wants to be, or just mostly worthless because somebody guilts him into it. It's like the prototypical modern hero story. So, I mean, what I'm saying applies to all time periods, that it's better to read stuff from other time periods mostly. And, when you could have, or in those narrow time periods when it's possible, watch movies and so on. But especially in our time period where so much is just written by people who are so catastrophically wrong about the world, they embed a ton of lies into their art, thinking that they're truths. So it goes even more so today. But it's probably the thing I'm going to end with is just to consider that the heights to which something can reach is a measure of the depths to which it can sink. And so if you can't be very good, you also can't be very bad. But if you can be great, you can be awful. And the larger the potential is for something to be awful, the more careful you have to be about what you are going to experience, what you're going to subject yourself to from it. Because in the same way, you want to be careful about picking your friends, to pick friends who are going to elevate you, not friends who are going to lower you. Art is a lot like that. You need to pick your art based on what is going to make you, what is going to improve your soul, what is going to make you a better human being, because it can do very much the opposite. And so if what you want is light fluff, don't find it in something that can be terrible. Find your light fluff in something that can't be all that bad. So, take up hobbies. Watch sports over watching modern made movies that may well be very bad. Play video games over doing that. You have to be a little careful with video games, because some video games have some pretty intricate stories which have the same potential for being wonderful or awful that movies and books and songs do. But the moral of the story is to remember your strengths, remember your weaknesses, adjust things to take in, for those things where you need to be the strongest, make sure you're least likely to fail, and most likely to succeed. And so one of the best ways of doing this when it comes to art that can really convey a lot of truth or a lot of falsehood is stick with older stuff that's been filtered through people saying that it's good, and you're likely at least to notice whatever's false in it, as opposed to modern stuff where it's much more likely to slip by and fool you and trick you into making mistakes in life that will just lead you to be less happy. And yeah, the other thing is, don't look down at light fluff. It is much better to use light fluff for when all you have the energy for is light fluff than it is to use something that requires you to be very energetic and on your guard and at your best when all you have the energy for is light fluff. So yeah, that's the other thing. Don't look down on light fluff. There's a lot of wisdom in measuring your strength and only testing yourself as far as you're actually able to meet the test. So until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.